How do I become a journalist? Is bookbinding a job anymore? Who makes the packaging my cereal comes in? What does a 50-year career look like? Can you really have it all? What does it take to get where you want to be? Or what if you don't know where you want to be? Through the Stationers' Company, I speak to some hotshot professionals from the content and communications industry to try and discover what a career in their chosen field looks like and ask them to share some of the great stories they've collected. The Stationers' Company was formed in 1403, and boy, has this industry changed since then. From the early booksellers and illustrators selling their wares in the shadow of St. Paul's, to the dawn of copyright registration and the arrival of the printing press, to today's digital media and artificial intelligence, the crafters, traders and writers of these industries all find a home here. So, whether you're putting pen to paper or making the pens and paper, I'll bring you a glimpse into a stationer's career. This is ps&qs. I'm joined today by the current master of the Stationers' Company, Paul Wilson. Thank you so much for joining me today, Paul. Hello.
Hello, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Paul, you're a stationer now, but you weren't always. And you've had such an interesting route into the content and communications industry, as we call it. And I'd like to start by asking you about your 20s. I know you spent some time in the military, focused on languages, which I think is fair to say was your first of a few careers. And I'd like to start by asking if you can tell me about these early days with languages as your specialism.
Sure. So I joined the army in 1975 when the Cold War was still very much at its peak. And there was always a requirement in the army for people with language skills. There were people who'd studied Arabic and Greek and Spanish. And there was a requirement also for people who would study both German and Russian. And that was the route I ended up taking, although originally I'd pushed to go and do Arabic, but I was directed to do German in the first place and then Russian. So out of my 10 years in the army, I spent a quarter of it, 2.5 years, on long language courses. And then I was sent off to do various jobs where the army could make best use of those language skills.
Which languages do you speak?
So, the one that I was most trained up on was Russian. And so the Russian level was interpretership. The German was formally linguist, but probably roundabout interpretership by the time I'd left the army. In subsequent careers, I've also tinkered with Persian and Urdu, but they're also rusty. Russian is tolerable, but it needs time to crank it up. Yeah.
And can you tell me a little bit, you've mentioned to me before the Army School of Languages.
So the Army School of Languages was based at Beaconsfield in Buckinghamshire. And during the immediate post-war period, it had a lot to do with holding German prisoners. And out of that seems to have developed at some stage the need to develop language skills. Anyway, when I was there, it was the place where you would go if you wanted to learn Arabic, Russian, and a bit of German in the army. And it took officers and other ranks, and it also took diplomats, because the Russian language course was so good that the Foreign Office would send its diplomats to the Army School of Languages to learn Russian.
You've said to me before it's had quite an interesting set of alumni. Is there anyone you can tell me about in particular?
Well, there are a bundle of people whose names don't leap out at me now, but, significant literary figures. I think Alan Bennett did the Russian course. I think D.M. Thomas did the Russian course as well. So a bundle of people who went on to have literary careers in the world of the arts.
You're in good company.
Yeah, I'm at the bottom end of that.
And how did you actually find a job in languages, putting these languages into practice?
Well, the Army had a method called the Army Language Aptitude Test. Once you did that, they would sort of send you on an intermediate level language course. And if you did okay with that, you then probably be considered for the more advanced one. That was the route in my case. And from there, once I'd finished my Russian course, I was asked to go off and train other soldiers in Russian for about a year. And at the end of that year or so, I had the opportunity to go off to Berlin on what was a dream posting.
Tell me more.
So, after the end of the Second World War in 1946, the Russian and British commanders in Germany wanted a means of preventing any outbreak of conflict between their two armies in newly occupying Germany. So they created reciprocal liaison missions. The British one, based in Berlin, was called Brixmis, the British Commander-in-Chief's mission to the Soviet forces in Germany. Founded in 1946, there was a reciprocal Russian mission in West Germany. The French and the Americans followed suit, and they established liaison missions as well. And that really occupied the last 2 years of my time in the army, but it was such a fantastic job. I thought at the end of that, well, I'm not going to get anything quite so good as this in the army again. So I then found myself moving into a different career. But for that 2 years, I had a pretty interesting and at times exciting spell, including a spell of about 6 weeks when I was allowed to go over, and the task was to tour around in East Germany. And essentially what the real task was to go around photographing bits of Soviet military equipment, taking photographs of deployments in the field of Soviet troops and so on. So it was one component of Western analysis and monitoring of the Soviet forces in East Germany. But also I was allowed to go across to Potsdam, where the mission house was in East Germany. And there we would meet, and I'd be deployed to talk to relatively senior Russians, maybe up to rank of colonel, who had responsibility for liaising with our unit and also bringing us to heel if we were overdoing things. And then there was another very interesting, although short-lived experience, which was my boss used to be the main man responsible for supporting the British governor of Spandau Prison, where Rudolf Hess was still being incarcerated at that time. And when my boss went off on 2 or 3 weeks annual leave, I was asked to stand in. Having both Russian and German, that was I was quite well equipped to do that. And it essentially meant attending the 4-power committee meeting for the governance of Spandau Prison with the British governor as his aide, whilst the French, American and Russian or Soviet governors similarly had people who would back them up as interpreters. And the tasks involved not just assisting the British governor of Spandau Prison at those meetings, but also censoring Hess's communication with his family. So, we had to read his correspondence with his family and see if he was saying anything which was contrary to the regulations imposed after the Nuremberg trials on the incarceration of former leading Nazis. So we were looking to see if he was talking about anything relating to that period, 1933 to 1945. Those were the years that were supposed to be blanked out of his life. He also had the opportunity to watch some television and listen to radio. So it wasn't a really punitive incarceration. But he could never watch any TV program or listen to any radio program that related to the periods of the Nazi regime, so 33 to 45. Anything that tipped over into that area was forbidden to him. And we would go through copies of the radio and TV publications which said what was on that night or the following night. And we would strike through anything that he had ticked he wanted to see. If it breached the regulations and he was not supposed to see it, we would cross it out.
Gosh, you've got quite a few languages under your belt. How easy do you find it to learn languages?
I found it very easy to learn German and Russian, but I'd done those both when I was in my 20s. When I was in my 30s, I started learning Urdu and Persian. I found Urdu quite difficult because it's like a combination of 3 different languages blended together at once. Persian, I found at that time much easier. So we're talking about here the early 90s. So we're talking about sort of like 30 years ago. And I found that I had wished I had only tried to focus on Persian at that time because it was an easier language to learn. But 30 years later, I suddenly realized that the mind was not as sharp, the ability to pick up nuances in language was not as sharp, and the memory was not as retentive. And I soldiered on until 2021, so for about 3 years, quite intensively. But I gave up in disgust because I found that in my 60s, I just couldn't do it the justice that it deserved.
Is there a scale of how difficult a language is to learn? Presumably it's different depending what your native language is.
Yeah,
but as an English speaker.
Yeah, there was a very clear list compiled by the Foreign Office, which I saw certainly back in the 80s and 90s. And Russian wasn't that high up on the list. Obviously, it was rated above French, German, Spanish, Italian, but it wasn't phenomenally hard language. You go up another level and you're coming to Arabic and things like that. But the very top was reserved, I think, for 4 languages. I think Mandarin and Cantonese. And then I think it was Thai and Laotian were rated as the 4 most difficult languages for a Brit to learn.
Fascinating. You've talked already a little bit about the second part of your career, that step that you made into the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. How did that move to the Foreign Office happen?
Well, I was in Berlin at the time, and the military mission was located inside the old headquarters of the Berlin Olympic Stadium, the office administration building. Very impressive, possibly some of the nicest military accommodation anywhere. And the building was shared between the military liaison mission and the diplomats who were manning the British military government. The military government was overseen by a major general, but large part of the staff were rather like an embassy. There were senior diplomats and then right down to middle-ranking and junior diplomats. And we had quite a lot of interaction with them. And inevitably, I thought, well, this would be rather interesting. I sort of tapped up some people in there and suggested that, I would be interested, how could I go about joining the Foreign Office? And, there was the usual series of inordinately long processes and exams and all the rest of it to go through. But it somehow worked out. So from Berlin in 1985, I left the army, went back to the UK, and by the beginning of 86, I was in the Foreign Office.
And your job at the Foreign Office, what were you doing?
The classic stuff. First of all, you sort of get inducted, you do the various training elements that you need to do, and then you would go off and serve in different departments as a junior desk officer. So I was looking at, in particular, Czechoslovakia as it then was, one unified country, and Albania. And then I spent some time also with the Southern Africa department, where I was responsible for looking at Angola, Zambia, the African National Congress in exile. They were in exile at that time because this was not just the period of the Cold War, it was also the period of apartheid. So the ANC was based in Lusaka in Zambia. And I also had some responsibility for Namibia as a desk officer. And at that time, Namibia was about to become independent from South Africa. So it was a very interesting time again. I did have a crack at learning Zulu. I couldn't sustain it. Very interesting language, click language. So there you go. So I had a number of years doing that sort of thing and various training courses. Until in 91, I had the opportunity to go off to Pakistan, to the High Commission in Islamabad. And that's where I went, and I was appointed first secretary in the political department, where my role was primarily to look at Afghanistan, but also to look at other countries in Central Asia, because, of course, by this time, they'd broken away from the Soviet Union, had basically dissolved. And a lot of the countries in Central Asia were starting to formulate new alliances, new interests. I had a lot of activity monitoring what was going on in Afghanistan. So in 91, the Soviets, they'd pulled out in 89, just before the collapse of the Soviet Union. And my task was to monitor the situation which had been left behind by them. So they had a kind of puppet regime in place. And that meant me doing things like talking to various people, representatives of other embassies and high commissions, going up to Peshawar on the frontier, meeting various people there, quite often Afghans who were in exile, meeting Afghan journalists who were still trying to cover what was going on in the aftermath of the Soviet pullout. So I'd been doing that for probably about a year when suddenly things took a turn in Afghanistan. And the old puppet regime that had been left in place started to crumble. There was a rebellion in the north amongst the Uzbek leadership, one of the ethnic minorities in the north. And that precipitated the collapse of the regime. And by, I think it was April 1992, various powerful mujahideen groups moved into Kabul, overthrew the old regime. And in consequence, the Foreign Office wanted to establish relationship with the new regime.
Gosh.
And therefore, there was a Foreign Office mission sent in, led by the then head of South Asian Department. We went in for discussions with the new government. And that was an absolutely fascinating moment because it was still very tense. We weren't sure whether the different mujahideen groups were going to turn on each other immediately. So we had then probably not quite a week wandering around, staying in the superb residence that had been built prior to the First World War. It was like a massive country house, wonderful bedrooms, wonderful library, quite atmospheric moments, opening the embassy's last remaining bottle of sherry and sipping a glass of it while watching tracer rounds being fired up into the mountains. It was very atmospheric.
Did you ever feel unsafe in your line of work with the Foreign Office?
Well, I think that the most edgy it got was actually during that first visit because the atmosphere was so tense. And we'd had a call on the new Minister of Defense. It was a man called Ahmad Shah Massoud, who'd become a figure of some romantic attachment in the Western press. He was really a resistance leader from the northeast of the country. He'd been appointed Minister of Defense in the newly formed Mujahideen government. But there was a lot of opposition to him from certain other, hardline elements within the Mujahideen. And as we were sitting in the Ministry of Defense in his office, with the flak curtains wound down, so designed to prevent any glass coming our way, there was some pretty heavy gunfire outside, immediately outside. And even he started to look nervy. As all hospitable Afghans will do, the solution was to go and have dinner. So we moved to a back room and had some dinner together, and the back room was further away from the gunfire. So obviously he didn't want to start off his tenure ending up having the dead bodies of the British diplomatic mission on his carpet.
Not.
So that was another quite interesting moment.
How much say did you have over where your postings were while you were in the Foreign Office?
That's a very good question. There was a kind of a game that was played, which went something like this. The Foreign Office would offer you a posting. So I had been the desk officer for Angola,
yes,
and it was suggested that I should go on a familiarization trip to Luanda, which I did do, and I stayed there with the chap who was the second and subsequently first secretary in the embassy. It was an eye-opening experience. And when I got back, I was called into the personnel officer who said, what did you think? I said, well, gosh, it's tough going. The person I stayed with has got some sort of tropical disease that nobody's been able to identify. There is cholera and typhoid rampant, shoal of sharks eating Soviet and Cuban soldiers. There is absolutely nothing to do for people other than get drunk. And he said, well, that's very interesting. I see from this that there is a swimming pool. I said, but the swimming pool has got a crack in the bottom and hasn't had water in it for 6 months. So he was now scratching his head and wondering exactly how he was going to sell me this thing. So he said, well, we were thinking of sending you there. So despite all the reasons why no sane person would accept a posting to Luanda at that time, he proceeded to offer it to me. So anyway, I went away and sort of turned it down for one reason or another. And the next time round, they played a very different game of cards. It was interesting to see the way they did it. Mm-hmm. They said, we've got the following 4 postings, and they were great postings. I mean, I do remember Kuala Lumpur was one, Amman in Jordan was another. These were great locations. The 4th one was Pakistan. And the principal interest in Pakistan was, of course, the fact that it was bordering Afghanistan, where the war was still bubbling away. And they said, which of those do you think might attract you? And I said, well, look, I'll accept any of them, preferably in the following order. And again, for one reason or another, Pakistan was at the bottom of my hit list. But that was their game all along. They wanted me to go to Pakistan, but they were just dangling the bait of, the exotic Kuala Lumpur and the wonderful Jordan in front of me. So I got the one that was number 4 on my list, but actually it turned out to be a fascinating time.
Sounds like a wonderful job that you had there, but I know you did move on from there. What was that decision for you? Why to leave and where did you go to?
Well, there were various points. So at that stage, by then I was about 41 and a late entrance to the Foreign Office. So my future career progress was going to be limited. And having spent half my working life, by then it was, as a Crown servant and a relatively lowly Crown servant, I wasn't financially well off. So I thought, well, I'd better get into the private sector and start making a bit of money for my old age and to support my, no doubt, increasingly expensive activities at the stationer's company, which I wasn't even looking towards at that stage, but fortunately, forward planning. Anyway, some of the countries that had been in the Soviet Union were trying to get away from Russian as soon as possible as a demonstration of national and cultural independence. So countries like Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia did not want to do business in Russian. But in the Transcaucasus and Central Asia, Russian was still the working language. One company had been in touch with the Foreign Office, so they were looking for a Russian speaker. And it just so happened that crossed my path at the time when I realized I had to leave and go into the private sector.
Very good timing.
Very good timing. And that's what happened. I had a couple of interviews and all the usual stuff and found myself recruited by De La Rue, the banknote and passport, at that time, passport printer.
Yes. I hadn't heard of De La Rue until I met you. So I wonder if you could tell our listeners a little bit more about De La Rue. What do they do as a company?
Sure. So De La Rue was founded in 1813, so it's a little over 200 years old. It had got involved in various stationery activities, producing diaries and things like that in the early 19th century. It had also been producing things like playing cards and stamps. In the middle of the 19th century, it had the opportunity to print its first banknotes for Mauritius. And it did so, supplied them, and that rapidly became a very lucrative part of De La Rue's portfolio. So I joined in 94 and retired from there in 2015. And over that period, it was the world's leading banknote producer, supplying banknotes or banknote paper to about 70 countries around the world.
Gosh. It's so easy to assume that every country is going to print their own banknotes. But of course, they don't have the infrastructure
don't
that
have
you need.
The capacity, and what's more, wouldn't have a large enough annual demand for banknotes to make that factory workable. So De La Rue had basically supplied banknotes to just about every region of the world, whether it was small islands in the Pacific, countries in Southeast Asia and South Asia, across Middle East to Europe, both East and West, and then Latin America, Caribbean. In that time, De La Rue got the contract, was awarded the contract to supply or manage the banknote production for the Bank of England.
Great.
Which is what it still has. I can't claim any credit for that. That was done by a different group of people. But that reinforced its position as the leading banknote supplier in the world. Apart from, the Americans who were producing their own, and obviously the Chinese and the Russians were producing their own. So I eventually ended up in 2000 as the director of the sales team covering the world. And you would see various kind of political developments around the world taking place, which would suddenly cause a requirement for new banknotes. So, the dissolution of the Soviet Union created 15 new states.
And was that 15 new currencies?
Exactly. And then, of course, around about the same time, the dissolution of Yugoslavia led to about 5 or 6 new countries. So there was a lot of banknote business to be done. And, of course, the launch of the euro. And it's not widely known, but De La Rue did quite a bit of work on the euro. And I was involved in certain elements of that. So it was an incredible, from about 1990 to, I would say, the early 2000s, over a 13, 14-year period, incredible amounts of political change going on that stimulated a requirement for new designs of banknotes.
With your experience at De La Rue, I wanted to ask what your opinion is on cryptocurrencies today.
Right, okay. Yeah, well, I think the experience at De La Rue doesn't really equip one to have a view of cryptocurrencies, but my view is this, that they're not based as currencies used to be based on the convertibility to gold. When the gold convertibility eventually, stage by stage, collapsed in the last century, currencies became really based on the commitment of a government to back them. So if the currency started looking as though it collapsed, the government would step in, take action, so that the purchasing power of your currency remained good. That was what a fiat currency is. It was good because the government said it was good. Not backed by gold. Not after 1971 anyway.
Right.
In the case of cryptocurrencies, they do not have government backing. So if at some stage the cryptocurrency collapses, you're not going to get the government stepping in to shore it up. You can't convert it into gold. And by that time, any possibility of converting into another currency, such as the dollar or sterling, has gone, because people won't want to convert, so they'd be very unreliable as a foreign reserve. What they are looking at doing is issuing their own digital currencies in competition with cryptocurrencies. So-called central bank digital currencies, and they should be backed by central banks. But having looked very closely at this issue up until about 4 years ago, my eye is very much off the ball, and I'm not sure which direction these things are going in. But I've always been deeply skeptical of cryptocurrencies.
Very wise. I wanted to know if you have an opinion on the wider digitization of money, so the transition from cash to card.
Yep.
That seems to have happened very quickly over the last kind of 5 years or so in the UK. Do you think that's going to affect the UK infrastructure in any way? Is it happening as fast in other countries?
Well, I think there are two issues here. One is a very fundamental issue of how is money created? What creates money? Once upon a time, it was basically the government. Well, yeah, it was primarily the government that would create money. Then, as time went on and commercial banks started to emerge, maybe in the 17th century, commercial banks had the power to take a deposit, to keep 10% of it in store, and to lend out the other 90%. So they started creating money in their own right by their lending process. What's happening now is that the whole management of money, or the transmission of money, let's call it the transmission of money, is happening increasingly through technological devices, which are increasingly in the hands of big tech. And the big tech companies may at some stage move to take up the space that was occupied by the commercial banks who could lend money out. Are we going to see Apple loans or microdosh or something like that? Where does it lead to? So, there is an incredible change underway, accelerated a bit by coronavirus.
Yes.
I think there's definitely much less inclination to carry cash as a result of coronavirus. Not because people are frightened about its transmission of germs, but simply because they got out of the habit of using cash over a period of a couple of years. The other thing that we should bear in mind, and I've written very briefly about this in one of my books, it also contains vulnerabilities. And we know, for instance, that all sorts of states have the ability or the will or the intention to attack digitized systems, desiring to hack the system and to filter, to extract lots of money from that system. But it also leaves a very big question mark over the ability to defend those systems if things go horribly wrong, really, really badly wrong. So there you go. I think there's, on the one hand, the prospect that big tech might take over certain of the roles of the commercial banks in creating money, and on the other hand, the threat from certain, shall we say, bad players, if that's a term, to attack our systems if it suits them to do so.
Mm-hmm. You've given us lots to think about there. Are there any moments, pivotal moments, that you can pinpoint where maybe your career trajectory would have taken a different turn?
That is a really good question. I think there was a key point for personal reasons in 2006 when I might have taken a different direction. And at that stage, I had been with De La Rue since 1994, so 12 years, and I'd been travelling really hard. Similarly, I'd been travelling in the Foreign Office and with the Army, and going even further back, my family had emigrated to Australia when I was 13, so I'd effectively been around the world by the time I was 17. By that time, I was quite fed up with travelling, I think, even to the extent that at one stage, I think it must have been around about 2009, Alison, my wife, won a free holiday to Mauritius. She won a holiday to Mauritius.
I know where this is going, don't say it.
Called me to say, guess what, we've got a free holiday in Mauritius. And I was so unenthusiastic. I said, would you like to take a friend?
How did that go down?
Well, she handled it very cleverly, actually. She said, take a look at the hotel website first. So I did, and that was very clever.
An informed decision.
Yeah, the right decision.
That swimming pool was full and in good condition.
It had excellent restaurants, Roux Brothers restaurants, and So that was the degree of, how fed up I was with travel at that stage. I could have, I suppose, have left De La Rue in 2006 and gone in a completely different direction. But actually, I had to decide to stay with De La Rue because they gave me a job that, was relatively straightforward, didn't demand lots of travel, and I retained the financial benefits. And of course, by that time, I was 51, I think, 51, 52. And I was skeptical that I could easily walk into an alternative job with similar financial benefits. So that was one point. And then I suppose there would have been further back another point where I was thinking about what I'd do if I were to leave the army. And one prospect in the probably early 80s, late 70s, more like, was to go to the Hong Kong police force.
Very different.
Yeah, I mean, a quite exotic opportunity to learn Cantonese, quite interesting. But for whatever reason, I never went down that route.
As we speak, you're now master of the Stationers' Company, the London livery company that brings everyone on this podcast together. What does being master of the company mean?
What does it mean, or what does it entail?
Ooh, let's say, what does it entail?
Okay, so it entails essentially two tracks of activity. One is the internal stuff, and that can involve chairing the Master and Wardens Committee, chairing the court, trying to assist the company in its various activities. So, for instance, speaking at things like the Innovation Excellence Award, appearing at things like the Shine Awards, and trying to assist wherever the clerk in the office might need my assistance. So that's the internal stuff. Then there's the external stuff, and that is essentially representing the company in its dealings with other livery companies. We're close to about 25 or 30 other livery companies. In dealings with the corporation, the City of London, where we're not so busily active, in dealing with people like the Lord Mayor and the sheriffs, and then in all the other activities like liaising with our armed forces affiliated units, and so on. So that's the external stuff. It's kind of representational stuff.
A lot of relationship building, cultivation.
Yeah, so that's what it entails. Now,
if I ask, what does it mean? How would you answer that differently?
I would say, what does it mean to me, or what does it mean to the company?
Both, Paul. Let's go for all of the answers today.
What does it mean to me? To me, the Stations Company is a grand old institution that's been around for 600 years, has done tremendous work across a range of things. Not only did it invent copyright that we know about, it has been involved in charitable activity, well-documented charitable activity on a regular scale since 1608. So its charitable activity in terms of benevolence has been going on for about 300 years before the invention of the state pension and national insurance and benefits and so on. So like all the livery companies, it's been doing a fantastic job in terms of charitable activity. We should also bear in mind that it's investing in the future through its foundation, and through encouraging young stationers. So we are trying to invest to encourage young people into our trades. And then, of course, what we do is we preserve the heritage. So here we have a Grade 1 hall, a scheduled monument. The Roman wall runs underneath the west part of it. The book warehouse in the courtyard is the only remaining 17th century warehouse in London. So it's got a variety of important sort of heritage treasures here. The archive is of international importance. People are researching our archive in the United States, in Canada, and in all sorts of far-flung locations. So we have a tremendous heritage to maintain. And this is what it means to me, that it is such an important organisation that's not yet fully understood, I think, by a lot of people in this country.
Mm-hmm. I've presumed that originally you were eligible for membership of the company many years ago because of the work you did printing, maybe in the unconventional sense with De La Rue. But you've also published 3 books, haven't you?
Yeah. So one is about the Stationers Company, and particularly about the Stationers Company's involvement in the settlement of North America. Mm-hmm. So there's quite a bit of material in our archives which demonstrate that the company was, along with other livery companies, investors in the Second Virginia Charter. So the 1609 Charter, which established, put the first surviving settlement on a solid financial footing. So we were involved in that. One of the Mayflower Pilgrims was a member of this company. The first Bible printed in North America, the Algonquin Bible, was printed by a member of this company. And the first newspaper, which survived only one edition, but the first newspaper in America was also printed by a member of this company. So we have a tremendous position in the foundation of what is now the United States. So that was the first one. And the other 2, won't surprise you, are about monetary history. Mm-hmm. One about what happens to money in times of conflict, and the other one about the decisions that new states make when they have to introduce a currency.
And I'm going to carry on with the book questions because I am instating a 3-book recommendation as a regular feature of ps&qs. Yeah. So we're thinking desert island discs, but with books.
Right.
You know, the ones you appreciate, the ones that would keep you occupied, ones that maybe you'd want others to read. Which 3 books would you choose?
Yeah. So having thought about this carefully, I would say, the three might not be those that appeal to everybody, but they're certainly the three that I would want. So the first one is a book called Holinshed's Chronicles, first published in 1577. It appears in 4 parts in that first edition, and I've got 3 out of the 4 parts, and I need that 4th part. So
this is your opportunity to get it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So if anybody wants to crowdfund my acquisition of the fourth part, this is the opportunity. The second book I'd like to have is Hakluyt's Principal Navigations, and it records the geographical discoveries essentially by Brits, but it's a sort of slightly overplays the role of the English in discovering the world, but it is a great classic. And then the third one would be Camden's Britannia, which I specifically want in the 7th edition because it was the first English language edition. All the others had been in Latin. The translator, interestingly, of the 7th edition was somebody called Philemon Holland, whose son, Henry Holland, was an apprentice to the publishers of the Latin editions, so he'd fixed it for his father to get the translation job. There are 3 great classics of Elizabethan literature and history and travel. And what is additionally interesting is that a man called George Bishop was involved in the publication or printing of all of them. And Bishop was really the giant of the Stationers' Company in the last part of the 16th century and the beginning of the 17th century. He was master 7 times.
Wow.
5 times directly elected, twice standing in when somebody else died in office. And he was, I think, a giant in publishing really important books, but also played a very important role in ways that are still not completely understood in supporting the Elizabethan state and the Jacobean state, because he was master at the point at which James I became king.
3 books that I think would definitely keep you going on your desert island.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, massive books. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Paul.
Why, my pleasure. Thank you for listening to me.
And thank you everyone for tuning in. That was diplomat, printer, author, and present master of the Stationers' Company, Paul Wilson. I've been your host, Georgina Brown. Until next time. Created by Georgina Brown and Mike James, ps&qs is brought to you live from Stationers' Hall. This episode was recorded, produced, and with original music by Gordon Turner. A special thank you to the Stationers' Company.